Hey guys, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to implement GitHub and Google Open Authentication, that's OAuth, login in your Node.js Backend from scratch. You don't need to make use of a third-party library like Passport or OAuth.js, and we're going to have like a very simple clean flow. Now, OAuth is something we are all used to. In your applications, let me drag out an application. In your applications, it's something you have had to interact with. I'm going to zoom this page, right? In your applications, this is something you've had to interact with, and it's a simple way to get a user to sign up or log into your application. And what happens is you are interacting with like another application to extract basic user information and get these details stored in your database and assign it to maybe a plan or something. And that's like the whole goal. So instead of a user having to manually input their data, you can extract this from a large application like GitHub, Google, which is very trusted, and that serves as an authentication means for that particular user. Now, what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to be implementing authentication with this platform. We're going to get these details from this platform. I'm going to log it in the console, right? For example, and what happens, like the whole idea, the whole picture of what's happening is what's happening is your front end, which is the Next.js application, is interacting with a provider, for example, GitHub. And what happens is when I click this button, we're interacting with GitHub. Now, what GitHub is going to ask us if we are sure we want to make this sign in. Now, the moment we click on continue, we've been able to log in to our GitHub account. Now, at the point of logging into GitHub, some things have happened in the background, right? In the background, GitHub has given us a code. Now, this code has been sent to like a callback endpoint. This callback endpoint has been able to exchange this code for an access token. This access token has been used to talk again to GitHub. Now, this access token, this code has been used to talk back again to GitHub. Now, GitHub gives us an access token, which we can now use to act as if we are the user and make a request back to GitHub to be able to get the user's details. Now, that is all of what's happening back in the background, and that's what we're going to be doing. That's what we're going to be doing in this video. Now, that might sound very complicated, but we'll understand it as we go through this video. Now, the first thing you have to do before we write any code is we need to get some credentials from these providers. We're going to be making use of GitHub and Google for this video. We need to get credentials from GitHub, that is the client ID and the client secret. Now, for you to get these credentials, you need to create like an application with this platform. So you go to GitHub/settings. You go to github.com/settings/developer. Now you make sure your GitHub account is signed into the account. Then you click on the new OAuth app. Then you give your app a name. So I'm just going to say OAuth app demo 2. Now the home page URL, that is the URL for your front end application. Now for me, I'm going to be doing 3001. If you deploy to live, your domain is like what you're going to put here, right? You're going to add a description, then the callback URL, like I said. Now, what happens is when this button is clicked, I'm going to go back. Now, when this button is clicked, we are interfacing with one endpoint. Now, when we log in, now GitHub is going to send us to a callback endpoint. Now that callback endpoint, we have to define it here, and we're going to create a route for it. That is where like the real logic is actually happening. Now, this is your backend endpoint, and we're going to define that in a jiffy, right? So we're going to make sure our backend is on 4001, port 4001, and we're going to create endpoint of auth/github/callback. You're going to see all of that very soon. Then we're going to register the application, and this is going to give us a client ID, and then we can generate a client secret, and it gives us the client secret. Now we're going to copy this information and store them in an environment variable. So I'm going to go back here. I already initialized a basic Node.js application. So just using the npm init-y, and then we have a package.json, nothing serious here. So I'm just going to create a .env file. And in this .env file, we're going to store the GitHub client and the GitHub secret, right? I'm going to take this information from here. So there's the client ID. We're going to replace it here. And then the client secret, we're going to copy it from here and save it here. Now with this, we would be able to access GitHub securely with these details. Yeah. So with that setup already, we can now start setting up our route. But before we do that, we need to install Express to undo route. We need to install Axios to make HTTP requests to GitHub and Google, and we need to install .env to keep our secret safe since we're using a .env file. So I'm just gonna npm install Express, npm install Express, Axios and .env. While that is installing, then the next thing is we're going to create an index.js file which our route is going to leave. So we have to import Express. So yeah, so let's just say const express equals to require express. Then we're also going to import Axios, and then we're going to import .env. Now with all of this, then we need to configure .env, and then we need to initialize our Express application, and then let's define a port. Remember, when we're setting up the application, we set the port to 4001. So I'm not going to declare it in the env file, so let's just say 4001 here. Now that is going to be the port of our backend application, and now we can proceed to defining our Express route. So let's just call this GitHub. Yeah, now we're going to define the GitHub route. Now if you're conversant with Express, you know how to define. We're going to define a get endpoint. Now that get, and the path, this is where when they click the button, this is where we're going to redirect them to. This is the endpoint they are going to touch on, and it's going to be /auth/github. You can take away the auth, the /auth is not important, right? And then where Express is going to give us access to the request and the response for us to interact with the server, for us to be able to interact with the server. Now on this endpoint, you're going to be doing two basic things. We're going to be building a GitHub login URL for a user to be able to log into their GitHub account, and then we're going to tell GitHub that, okay, this is my application. That's through the URL. We're going to tell GitHub that this is my application. That is me that is setting up this authentication. This is my application, and then we want this user to be able to log in. And then when they log in, we would like to access their email address. So that is like what we want to do here. So we're going to construct a URL. But first of all, let's construct a redirect URL. We're going to construct a redirect URL. So our endpoint is HTTP 4001. Yeah, so remember when we were setting up the application earlier on, when we were setting up the application, we set up the authorization callback URL. So that is where we want to redirect the user to when we have logged them in. So this is the redirect URI. Now we're setting it to a variable because we need it to construct the URL that would help the user log in and then redirect the user. Now the next information we need is the client ID, which we have stored in the env file. So that's GitHub client ID. We need that as well. Now with this client ID, then we can now construct the URL that enables the user to log in, that redirects the user to this callback, endpoint, and then helps us get the email of the user, right? Now we're going to construct the URL, and then we're going to make use of the backticks, and then now I'm going to copy this endpoint and then explain what's happening here. Now this is the URL, and what's happening here is we're accessing the GitHub login endpoint. This is the usual GitHub login endpoint. Now, but for the O authentication, and what we're doing is we are authorizing with our client ID to tell GitHub that, yeah, this is a valid app that we're trying to access because we created an application. And then once with this client ID, the particular user will be able to log in. So that's where they click on the authorize button and co, right? Now, once that is happened, once the login is successful, we want to redirect the user to this URL that we defined here. Now, when we redirect the user, the main goal is we want to be able to extract the email from like the authorization and co. So this is the URL. And now the next thing we are going to do is we're going to create a response. So we are going to use the response and say, oh, we want to redirect this user to this URL that we've constructed here. Want to redirect the user to this URL that we've constructed here. And that is like, well, now since we're not making use of request here, we can just add like an underscore so it doesn't throw errors and all. So this is the first endpoint that we get to define. Now, after defining this endpoint, the next thing will be for us to define the callback endpoint, which we are redirecting the user to. So GitHub/callback, now the same request and the response. And like I said in the background, now what happens on the ground is when GitHub redirects the user to this callback endpoint, it attaches a code, something like a question mark code, code equals to then some value that is used only once. Now it attaches it on the background. Now what we want to do on this callback is we want to extract this code. We want to extract this code and make use of this code to generate an access token. That is the entire goal of this. And then we're now going to make use of this access token and pass it alongside header to be able to get the user detail. So first of all, let's get the code. We're going to get the code from the query. That is, like I just showed you how the code is going to be, right? And then once we get the code, we want to make use of this code to get an access token. So for us to get the access token, we're going to pass the code alongside the client ID, the client secret to the GitHub login access token endpoint. You're going to see all of that. Now token, we want to get the token, let's just say token response equals to await. We're going to make use of Axios to send a post request. Now this post request is going to go to GitHub/login. Let me copy the endpoint so there is no mistake. So we're sending a post request to GitHub/login/OAuth/access token, and we're going to be passing the client ID. Yeah, so we're going to be passing the client ID. We're going to be passing the client secret, and we're going to be passing this code that GitHub gives us that we can only make use of once. And then like here, we're adding all of this header information. And then with that, GitHub is going to verify this code and is going to give us an access token. So we're going to be able to get an access token from this response that we get here. We're going to be able to extract an access token. Now, when we get this access token, we're going to make use of this access token to be able to retrieve the user's details from GitHub. We're going to be able to use it to retrieve details like the user, the name of the user, and the email of the user. Now, we can't just make use of one endpoint to get this information. I think that's how GitHub works, right? You can't just make use of one endpoint. So I'm just going to paste in all of this code so we can wrap this up quickly. Yeah. So what's happening here? I'm going to close this. Now we have the access token, and then we can now pass the access token to send a GET request to extract the user. This is just the regular endpoint that we all use to extract users. So normally GitHub, we can be able to generate an access token from our GitHub dashboard and use it to extract user. But now we are doing it on behalf of the user using this access token that we have gotten through our redirect and all, right? So now that we have the access token, we're now able to make this request on behalf of the user to be able to get the user details, and then we also make another request to get the email. And then what we are doing for the email is we are like filtering it to be able to get the verified email. You know, there is a way for you to add like more than one email to your GitHub account. So we're trying to get the primary email and the verified email. So when we get the email, now we're able to get this data. You'll notice we now have access to the name of the authenticated GitHub user and the email of the authenticated user, GitHub user. This is like where you undo the real logic of storing the details to database, of like ensuring you try to verify if this email is already in your database. If the email is already in your database, you generate an access token. That is your app token, and then maybe like store it in cookie and perform authentication and all of that. And then the next thing is you redirect the user to maybe your dashboard or something. For me, I have my application on 3001, and then I just want to redirect them to a small success page. Now, with this endpoint already created, we can come here and run node index.js. Yeah, oh sorry, nothing is going to run because we have not finalized setting up our Node.js application. So we need to listen to the 4001 port. So I'm just going to add this here. So we want to listen to the port and just say yes. So now we can come back here and run node index.js. So it's running on 4001. We have our backend. Now I'm going to show you a very basic front end that I created. I'm just going to zoom this code. This is a Next.js application. This is a Next.js application, and all this application is doing is we have two buttons. We have the login with GitHub and login with Google. I'm just going to comment this code for now. And so we have just the login with GitHub button. Now what this button does is there is really no logic for you to handle on the front end. All you just have to do is go to your button. Let's just give it the type of button. You go to your button and you add an onClick. You add an onClick, and this onClick is just redirecting you to the endpoint. It's just taking you to the endpoint. Now from this endpoint is where we're going to construct the GitHub URL, and then we're going to be able to log in the user to GitHub and then perform all the authorization and co. So I launched this application. I'm coming. npm run dev, and it opens on 3001. And if you look at the sidebar, I also have a success page here, and it's just going to show success. Your action was successful, and that is why on the back end here we're redirecting the user to the success page right now. So on the front end, I'm just going to go to 3001, and you see we have the login with GitHub button here. Now when I click this login with GitHub button, it's supposed to take us to 4001. So when we come back here, I think there's a mistake somewhere. So auth 4001. So I think on the front end is where this error is coming from. And if you notice the button, on the button we're redirecting the user to 4000 instead of 4001, and there is no 4000 endpoint. So I'm just going to go back and reload this page, and then when we reload this page, we can click on login with GitHub, and then it's going to, now if you look at the URL here, you notice the client ID has been added here, and then once I log in, it will redirect us to this callback, and we're trying to get the email. So once I click on continue, we have logged into, so tells us that we're just trying to read the email address, and that is like the scope. We're just trying to read the email address. You can confirm all of the details, and then when you click authorize, the user has been logged in, and just monitor the URL. It immediately redirected us to the callback, and then it redirected us to the success page. Now when we go to the back end of our application, we notice that it logs the GitHub user. It logs my name and my verified email address, which I use for my GitHub account. Now these details is most likely going to be stored in your database, and you set the password to null, and this way you have been able to handle open authentication with GitHub. Now very similar to this is for Google. For Google is very similar to this, and you just have to create two the same similar type of endpoints for Google. But the first thing you have to do is you have to create an app on Google. So you just go to console. So if you can create, you go to console.cloud.google.com/API/credentials, and then when you get here, you'll be able to create. So you can create a project. I have a project already, so you can first create a project, then you click on the create credentials button here. Now when you click on create credential, you're going to create the OAuth client ID, which is what we need. So here you'll be able to specify the application type, which is going to be web application. Then you can give the name of the project. So I'm just going to leave it like this, and then this is going to so you're going to set the authorized JavaScript origin. The authorized JavaScript origin is going to be your front-end application, and remember in our case that is localhost 3001, right? Localhost 3001. Then the redirect, which is always important, that's like the callback endpoint on your backend. That's localhost 4001, and this time around it's not going to be GitHub because we're going to define it. It's going to be Google/callback and 4001. Now with all of this, you can now create your GitHub OAuth application, and it's going to give you access to your client ID and your client secret. So back to the environment variable, we're going to add two new secrets, and then we're just going to come here, copy the client ID, and go back here and paste it here. Quite lengthy. Then we're going to copy the client secret also and go back here and paste it. Now once you have all of this stored, let's stop our server already so we don't experience any bug later in the future. And then once we have that set up already, the next thing will be for us to set up the both endpoints for Google. So the first one is the endpoint that gets called when the button is clicked, and the second one is the callback, where we get a code from Google and then get an access token and then perform all the functions on the ground. So to make this fast, the first endpoint, so I'm just going to copy all of this, and I'm going to close this, and then come here and change this to Google, and change the endpoint here to Google, and then the URL is still going to be almost the same. Change this to Google, and this endpoint is going to change a little bit. So basically it's just this that's going to change. So this time around it's going to be Google / okay, it's quite different. I'm just going to replace this. So it's going to be accounts.google.com/o/auth2/v2/auth, and then we're going to pass the client ID. We're going to redirect, and then the response is going to be quite different. Now the response is, I'm just going to adjust that. So no longer scope. This time around, we're trying to get the response with the email and access the profile. I think all of that. So now this is the URL we're going to redirect the user to. Once they hit the auth/Google endpoint, we're going to redirect them. We're going to redirect them to this URL, and then when they log in their GitHub account, is going to redirect them to this callback endpoint, which we're going to create now. So it's going to redirect them to this callback endpoint. I'm just going to copy this callback endpoint and explain it. So I'm going to close this and then paste the callback endpoint here. Now this is a callback endpoint, and what's happening is, first of all, we're getting the code from the code in which Google is going to pass, right? We're going to get the code. Then we're also like the redirect URL, and what we're doing is we're sending a post request to the Google token endpoint. And what's happening is we're trying to get an access token from Google, but for us to get the access token, we have to pass the client ID, the client secret, the code in which we got, the redirect URL, and all of this. But I think you can do it with this. But now when you pass all of this information, we're going to be able to get an access token. And then when we get this access token, we're now going to be able to make use of this access token to get the user details from Google. Now we're going to send a GET request as if we're the user to Google, passing along the access token of that particular user. And then when we pass the access token, we're going to be able to get the name of the user and the email of the user. At this point is where you're going to save it to the database and then create an access token using the UUID which you generate for the particular user. But for us, we're just going to log the user details to the console, and then the next thing is we're going to redirect the user to the success page, and that is all that's going to happen. Now back to our front end application. I'm just going to uncomment this code for Google, and then what is happening is we're having the onClick again. Yeah, we're having the onClick event handler here again, and then we're just trying to hit the endpoint, the Google endpoint. And then if you look at the front end of our project, when I go to the home page, we now have the GitHub and Google. Now when you hit the Google endpoint, it's taking you to, okay, I have not yet started the server. So I'm going to go back to the backend and start the server again. Now, when I start the server, I'm going to come back here and hit the endpoint again. Now, when I hit, localhost 3001. Now, when I hit the Google endpoint, access blocked, authorization error. Okay, let's go back to the backend and look at the Google callback. So here in the Google endpoint, we're directing the user to 4001/callback. Oh, I think I see the error. Yeah, it's supposed to be 4001, right? Now, let's go back to localhost 3001, and then we log in with GitHub, and we still get it. I'm trying to look through the code, and I remember duplicating this code, and I see where the error is. So I'm using GitHub client ID here instead of the Google client ID here. This is why you should not copy and paste your code, right? Now we come back here and go back to localhost /3001. Sorry. And then we can log in with Google, and then it will redirect us. Okay, so what I'm just going to do is I'm going to verify these details. Most likely these details are wrong, right? So I'm going to click on the application again and copy the client secret just in case there is an issue. So I'm just going to save it. Do same for client ID, and then I'm going to stop running the application and run it again, and then go back here and click save, and then click login with Google. Oh wow. Okay, I guess maybe there was an error with the way I copied the details. Maybe there was a space somewhere or something. So you click on the user detail, you click on continue, and then it tells us the login was successful. And when we go to our application, it's going to give us the Google user details, which you can actually store in your database. So this is very simple way of you implementing open authentication in your backend and then using it in your front end. No much logic in the front end. All the logic comes from the backend, and in the backend, all you're doing is you're hitting an endpoint and then you're redirecting to another endpoint, which is like the callback endpoint, which handles the call logic. And this callback endpoint gets a code which you use to get an access token. And then this access token is what you use to make requests for the user to get the user details. And then you do all of the other things by storing the details in the database and then maybe generating an app token or an access token, which helps you know if an authenticated user or not. And that is how to implement OAuth in your backend application. I'll push the code to GitHub so you can pull the code and cross-check the code to see how it works. And you can also check my channel. I've created more detailed guides around backend application, integration with front end, two-factor authentication, and all of that. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.